Every avoidant relationship feels like it has its own story, its own language, its own set of exceptions that make you believe this one is different. It doesn't feel like something predictable. It feels intense, confusing, magnetic. It feels like something rare, and that's exactly why it's so hard to accept what's really happening underneath it all, because even though every moment feels unique, the ending almost never is. There's a pattern that quietly shapes everything from the very beginning, and by the time you start noticing it, you're already emotionally invested in a way that makes it hard to step back. You don't just walk away from something that felt real, you try to understand it, you try to fix it, you try to prove that what you felt wasn't just another version of the same story. But here's the part that hits the hardest. No matter how different it feels in the moment, every avoidant relationship is slowly moving toward one of two destinations. Not three, not five, just two. And the path you're on is being decided long before the ending ever arrives. At first, it doesn't look like a pattern. It looks like connection. It feels like depth. There's a pull that feels almost unexplainable, like something about this person just gets you without needing words. The way they open up in small, controlled moments makes you feel chosen, special, like you're seeing a side of them that no one else gets to see. And that illusion is powerful because it convinces you that the distance you feel later isn't rejection, it's just part of who they are. It makes you justify things you normally wouldn't. It makes you patient in ways that slowly start to cost you your own emotional stability. You begin to believe that if you just understand them enough, love them enough, stay consistent enough, everything will eventually settle into something secure. But the reality is, what feels like uniqueness is often just a familiar pattern wearing a different face. The connection feels real, yes, the emotions are real, but the way it unfolds, the way it progresses, the way it starts to confuse you more than it comforts you, that part follows a script that doesn't change as much as you think it does. And the deeper you go, the more you start to notice something that doesn't quite make sense. One moment, everything feels close, effortless, like you're finally building something stable. They're present, engaged, even emotionally open in ways that give you hope. It feels like progress, like things are finally moving forward. And then something shifts. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make you question what just happened. The energy changes, the responses slow down, the warmth fades into something distant, something harder to read. And suddenly, you're left trying to figure out what you did wrong. You replay conversations in your mind, searching for the exact moment things changed, but there's no clear answer. Because the shift didn't come from something you did, it came from something they felt. And that's where the confusion begins to take hold. Because how can something feel so real one moment and so uncertain the next? This is the push and pull that defines the entire experience. It's not random, it's not accidental, it's a cycle. Closeness creates discomfort, and distance creates relief. But that relief doesn't last, because distance also creates a different kind of discomfort, the fear of losing the connection entirely. So they come back, not always fully, not always consistently, but just enough to pull you back into that feeling of hope. And that's what keeps the cycle alive. You start adjusting without even realizing it. You become more careful with your words, more aware of their moods. You try to maintain the closeness without triggering the distance, but the more you adapt, the more you lose your natural sense of security. Because now, instead of feeling the relationship, you're managing it. And that's exhausting in a way that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't experienced it. What makes it even harder is that the connection itself never fully disappears. It's always there, just beneath the surface. Even in moments of distance, there's still something that makes you feel like this isn't over. Like there's still something worth holding on to, and that's what creates the illusion that things are still building towards something stable. Because how can something that feels this real, this emotionally intense, not lead to something meaningful in the end? But that's the question that slowly starts to break you down. Because the more time passes, the more you realize that feeling something deeply doesn't always mean it's moving in a healthy direction. And that realization is one of the hardest things to accept. because it forces you to separate what you feel from what you're actually experiencing. And somewhere in the middle of all this, without any clear announcement or defining moment, the relationship starts moving toward an ending. Not the kind of ending you can easily see or prepare for, but a direction, a destination that's already forming beneath the surface. You might not see it yet. You might still believe that things are going to turn around, that clarity is coming, that consistency is just one conversation away. But the truth is, the direction is already being set by the patterns that keep repeating. By the way, closeness is followed by distance. By the way, your needs are slowly being minimized so the connection can survive. By the way, you're holding on tighter while they're pulling away just enough to maintain control without fully committing. And this is where everything starts to matter more than it seems. Because the choices you make in these moments, the things you tolerate, the boundaries you don't set, the parts of yourself you silence just to keep the connection alive, all of it is shaping where this ends. It doesn't feel like it in the moment. It feels like you're just trying to make things work. But in reality, you're slowly moving toward one of the only two endings this kind of dynamic allows. And the hardest part is, you don't get to stay in the middle forever. Eventually, something has to give. Either the connection fades into something that leaves you questioning everything, or something shifts in a way that forces a completely different outcome. But right now, in this stage, it still feels like there's time, like there's still something you can do to change the direction. And that belief, that hope, is what keeps you emotionally invested even when things stop making sense. Because walking away feels like giving up on something that could have been real, and staying feels like slowly losing parts of yourself just to keep something uncertain alive. And that tension, that internal conflict, is exactly where this kind of relationship holds you the longest. Not in clarity, not in stability, but in between. And the longer you stay there, the harder it becomes to recognize which direction you're actually moving toward. And the longer you stay in that in-between space, the more something subtle begins to change inside you. It's not loud at first. It doesn't feel like a breaking point. It feels like adjustment, like you're just learning how to love them better, how to understand them deeper, how to make things smoother. You tell yourself that every relationship requires effort, that no connection is perfect, that patience is part of love. But what you don't realize is that your effort is slowly becoming one-sided in a way that's reshaping who you are within the relationship. You start anticipating distance before it even happens. You begin to read between lines that were never clearly written. You analyze tone, timing, energy. You become hyper-aware of every small shift, because every small shift has taught you that something bigger might follow. And without even noticing it, you begin to adapt your behavior to prevent those shifts. You hold back certain emotions because you don't want to overwhelm them. You delay expressing your needs because you don't want to push them away. You become more agreeable, more flexible, more understanding than you've ever been before. And on the surface, it looks like growth. It looks like maturity. But underneath it, there's a quiet form of emotional dependency forming, not because you're weak, but because you've been placed in a situation where stability feels conditional, where connection feels like something you have to maintain rather than something you can simply experience. And that's where the dynamic begins to tighten its grip. Because now it's no longer just about them pulling away and coming back. It's about you trying to keep them from pulling away in the first place. You start to feel responsible for the emotional balance of the relationship. If they're distant, you assume you did something wrong. If they're warm, you feel relief, like you've done something right. And slowly your sense of emotional security becomes tied to their inconsistency. That's the part that's hardest to recognize because it doesn't feel like dependency, it feels like care. It feels like you're just invested. But real investment doesn't make you question your worth every time the energy shifts. At the same time, something is happening on their side that you can't fully see, but you can feel. The closer things get, the more something inside them starts to resist. Not because the connection isn't real, but because closeness itself triggers something deeper. For them, intimacy isn't just warmth and comfort, it carries pressure, expectation, a subtle sense of losing control over their own space, their own identity. And even if they don't consciously understand it, they feel it. So when things start to feel too close, too emotionally intense, their instinct isn't to lean in, it's to create space. Not always by leaving completely, but by pulling back just enough to regain that sense of control. And that's why this cycle never feels predictable, even though it is. Because it's not based on logic. It's based on emotional triggers that don't follow a straight line. One moment they genuinely want closeness. The next moment that same closeness feels overwhelming. So they withdraw. And when they withdraw, you feel it immediately. The absence, the shift, the subtle coldness that replaces the warmth you were just holding on to. And that's where the confusion deepens because you're reacting to something that feels real, but you don't have a clear explanation for it. So you try to create one. You tell yourself they're just busy, just stressed, just going through something. And sometimes that might even be true. But the pattern doesn't change. This is the emotional environment where your needs and their fears begin to clash in ways that are almost impossible to resolve without awareness. You want consistency, reassurance, a sense of emotional safety. They want space, independence, a sense of control over how much they give and when. And neither of these desires are wrong on their own. But together, without balance, they create tension that builds over time, because the more you need clarity, the more they feel pressured. And the more they feel pressured, the more they pull away. And the more they pull away, the more you need clarity. It becomes a loop that feeds itself, slowly intensifying with each cycle. And eventually, you reach a point where something inside you starts to feel tired. Not just of the distance, but of the uncertainty, of not knowing where you stand, of constantly trying to read a situation that never fully reveals itself. You start to realize that no matter how much you give, no matter how much you understand, no matter how patient you are, the pattern continues. And that realization doesn't come all at once. It comes in moments, small, quiet moments where you feel the weight of everything you've been carrying. Moments where you ask yourself questions you've been avoiding. Questions like, how long can this continue? How much of myself am I willing to lose just to keep this connection alive? And this is where the relationship begins to move closer to its first destination. Not with a dramatic event, not with a clear ending, but with a gradual shift into something quieter, something more distant. The conversations become less frequent. The emotional depth starts to fade. The effort becomes inconsistent in a way that's harder to ignore. And instead of one clear moment where everything ends, it becomes a slow unraveling, a fading of something that once felt intense and full of possibility. And that's what makes it so painful, because there's no clear closure, no final conversation that gives you the answers you've been searching for, just a growing silence that replaces everything you once felt. This is the first destination, silent disconnection, and it doesn't always look like someone leaving. Sometimes they're still there, still responding, still present in small ways. But the emotional connection that once felt alive is no longer the same. It becomes distant, inconsistent, almost transactional, and you're left trying to hold on to something that no longer feels secure. You tell yourself that maybe it's just a phase, that things will go back to how they were. But deep down, you can feel that something has changed, something that isn't easily fixed by another conversation or another attempt to get closer. And the hardest part about this destination is what it does to you internally. Because without clear closure, your mind keeps searching for answers. You replay everything, trying to understand where it went wrong. You question your actions, your words, your worth. You wonder if you asked for too much, if you weren't enough, if you could have done something differently to change the outcome. And those questions don't have easy answers, because the ending wasn't caused by one specific moment. It was shaped by a pattern that existed long before you ever tried to make sense of it. And in that silence, you're left with feelings that don't fully resolve. A connection that never completely closed. An ending that never clearly announced itself. Just a slow, quiet distance that forces you to accept something you never wanted to face, that not every connection, no matter how real it felt, is meant to become something stable. And that realization stays with you, not because it's easy to accept, but because it changes the way you see everything that came before it. And just when it feels like that quiet ending is the only possible outcome, something unexpected begins to shift. Not in them at first, but in you. Because there's a limit to how long someone can sit in confusion before clarity starts to push its way in. There's a point where the emotional exhaustion becomes louder than the hope you've been holding on to, and it doesn't come from anger. It doesn't come from suddenly not caring. It comes from finally seeing things as they are instead of what you've been trying to believe they could become. At first, it feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because you've spent so much time adjusting yourself to keep the connection alive that choosing yourself feels like stepping into unknown territory. You stop over-explaining. You stop chasing clarity from someone who keeps avoiding it. You stop trying to manage their emotions just to protect the connection. And for the first time, you allow silence to exist without immediately trying to fix it. Not as a strategy, but as a boundary. And that shift, as small as it seems, changes everything about the dynamic. Because now, the energy is no longer one-sided. The constant reaching, the constant effort, the constant emotional availability that once held everything together begins to pull back. And when that happens, the entire balance of the relationship starts to move. The space that once belonged only to them now exists on your side too. And that's something they feel, even if they don't fully understand it at first. This is where the second destination begins to form. Not through force, not through persuasion, but through a shift in presence. Because when you stop chasing, you're no longer feeding the pattern that kept the cycle alive. You're no longer reinforcing the idea that distance will always be met with your effort to close the gap. And that creates something unfamiliar for them, something they can't easily navigate the same way they did before. At first, they may not react at all. They may continue the same patterns, expecting you to fill in the silence like you always have. But when that doesn't happen, when the usual response they rely on isn't there anymore, something begins to surface, not immediately as clarity, but as discomfort. Because the distance that once gave them relief now starts to feel different. It's no longer a controlled space they created, it's a space that exists without their control. And that changes how it feels. This is the part most people don't see coming. Because it feels like pulling away will end everything. It feels like stepping back means losing the connection completely. But what actually happens is more complex than that. When the dynamic shifts, it forces them to face something they've been avoiding, not you, but the emotional weight of your absence. And absence feels different when it's not something they chose. They begin to notice what's no longer there. The consistency they once took for granted. The emotional safety they didn't know how to hold on to. The presence that quietly supported the connection even when they were pulling away from it. And that realization doesn't always come in clear thoughts. It comes in feelings, in moments where something feels off, even if they can't fully explain why. And that's when the paradox begins to unfold. The more you let go, the more they start to feel. The more you stop needing reassurance, the more aware they become of what they're losing. And it's not because you're playing a game or trying to manipulate the outcome. It's because you've stepped out of the role that was holding the imbalance in place. You've stopped overcompensating for what they couldn't give consistently. And in doing that, you've created space for something real to surface, whether that leads to growth or a deeper realization of what can't be fixed. For some, this is the moment where they begin to move closer, not in the same inconsistent way as before, but with more awareness, more intention. They may not suddenly become completely secure or emotionally open overnight, but there's a difference, a shift in how they show up. Because now the connection isn't being maintained for them, it's something they have to actively choose. And that choice feels different when there's a real possibility of losing it. But this path, this second destination, isn't guaranteed. And that's the part that's important to understand. Because not every avoidant reaches this point of awareness. Not every situation transforms into something healthier just because you step back. Sometimes the distance remains. Sometimes the silence continues, and instead of moving closer, they stay where they are or move further away. And that's where the truth becomes unavoidable. This second destination isn't about changing them, it's about changing your position in the dynamic. It's about stepping out of a cycle that was slowly draining you and allowing whatever happens next to be based on reality, not effort alone. Because for something to truly grow, it can't rely on one person holding it together. It has to be mutual. It has to be chosen on both sides. And when you reach this point, something inside you becomes clearer than it's ever been before. You start to see that the outcome of this relationship was never just about how much you cared. It was about whether the dynamic itself could support something stable, whether both people were willing and able to meet in the same emotional space. And if that doesn't happen, no amount of effort can force it into existence. And that realization doesn't weaken you, it grounds you. It brings you back to yourself in a way that no amount of overthinking ever could. Because now, instead of asking how to make it work, you start asking whether it truly works for you. And that question, that shift in perspective, is what ultimately decides which destination you arrive at. And once you reach that point where you stop asking how to make it work and start asking whether it truly works for you, everything begins to look different. Not because the connection suddenly changes overnight, but because your lens does. You're no longer looking at the relationship through hope alone. You're seeing it through clarity, through patterns, through the emotional impact it has had on you over time. And that shift is powerful, but it's also uncomfortable. Because clarity doesn't always give you the answer you were hoping for. Sometimes it gives you the answer you were trying to avoid. You begin to notice things you once overlooked. The inconsistency that you once justified now feels heavier. The distance that you once chased now feels unnecessary. The emotional gaps you kept trying to bridge now feel like something that shouldn't have been yours to carry alone in the first place. And it's not that the connection wasn't real, it's that reality finally becomes louder than the story you built around it. And this is where one of the hardest truths settles in. You don't get both endings. You don't get to stay in the hope of what it could be while also protecting yourself from what it is. You don't get to keep chasing potential while expecting stability to somehow appear on its own. Every moment you stay in the same pattern is quietly choosing a direction. Even if it doesn't feel like a decision, it is. Because patterns don't pause, they continue until something interrupts them. For a long time, it may have felt like the outcome depended on them, on whether they would open up, whether they would become consistent, whether they would finally meet you where you are. But what you begin to understand now is that the outcome has always been shaped just as much by you, by what you accept, by what you allow to continue, by how long you stay in something that asks you to shrink just to keep it alive. Because the truth is, silent disconnection doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, through moments where you ignore what you feel just to maintain what you have, through times where you choose to stay quiet instead of expressing what matters to you, through compromises that slowly move you further away from your own emotional center. And before you realize it, you're no longer just experiencing the relationship, you're enduring it. And on the other side, growth and conscious separation don't happen by accident either. They happen when something shifts within you that refuses to keep repeating the same cycle. When you stop negotiating with your own needs, when you stop trying to earn consistency from someone who hasn't learned how to give it freely, when you decide that clarity matters more than temporary closeness. And that decision, even if it feels small at first, is what changes the entire trajectory. Because now you're no longer reacting to the pattern, you're stepping outside of it. And once you're outside of it, you begin to see it for what it truly is. Not a mystery, not something you need to decode endlessly, but a dynamic that either grows with mutual effort or slowly fades when that effort isn't shared. And that's when the final layer of truth becomes clear. It was never about defeating them. It was never about saying the right thing at the right time, or finding the perfect way to make them stay, or unlocking some hidden part of them that would suddenly make everything make sense. It was about understanding the reality of the connection and deciding what you're willing to continue experiencing. Because someone who is ready, truly ready, doesn't need to be convinced to stay consistent. They don't need to be guided into caring in a way that feels secure. They don't create a pattern where you feel close one moment and uncertain the next as a normal state of the relationship. And once you see that clearly, you stop trying to turn something inconsistent into something stable through effort alone. And that doesn't mean the connection didn't matter. It doesn't mean what you felt wasn't real. It means that real feelings don't always lead to the right outcome. And accepting that is one of the most difficult but most freeing realizations you can have, because it releases you from the idea that if you just tried a little harder, understood a little deeper, stayed a little longer, things would eventually become what you needed them to be. And maybe for a moment that realization hurts. Maybe there's still a part of you that wishes things could have unfolded differently, that wishes the connection had met you at the same level you were willing to give. But alongside that feeling, something else begins to grow, something steadier, something more grounded. You begin to feel a sense of control returning, not over them, but over yourself, over your choices, over the direction your life and your emotional energy are moving in. And that's something this kind of relationship slowly takes away without you realizing it until you take it back. Because in the end, the destination was never just about how the relationship ends, it was about what it turns you into along the way. Whether it pulls you into a cycle of confusion and self-doubt, or pushes you toward clarity and self-respect, whether it leaves you questioning your worth, or strengthens your understanding of it. So when you look back at everything, the connection, the confusion, the closeness, the distance, the real question isn't why it happened the way it did. It's what you're choosing now that you see it clearly. Because every avoidant relationship does end in one of these two destinations, one where things quietly fade and leave you searching for answers that never fully come, and one where something shifts, either within the connection or within you, that leads to clarity, growth, and a different kind of peace. And the direction you move in from here isn't something they decide. It's something you do